So I'm very briefly going to talk to you about a project that we designed and was delivered back in 2010 called the London Sustainable Industries Park. Back in 2010, but we thought it was a useful case study because we learned a lot through the process of working through this scheme. Just the graphic there showing you the location of the scheme, just down the river in Dagenham. So the project itself was incredibly interesting. It was an industrial park. The concept, the overriding concept was the waste material from each of the uses was actually the raw material for its neighbouring use, which was incredibly kind of aspirational. And it wasn't just the buildings and the uses that the client was focused on. They very much wanted the landscape and the arrangement of the park to embody these sustainable credentials. As part of that, the SUDS, the surface water management, was a very strong feature, not only as a practical drainage element, but actually waterways, rills, streams, both existing and proposed, established the framework for the plan. So water played a key part in the development of the project from the very early stages. And you can see here how that network of waterways, both streams and sustainable drainage elements and components, formed the framework for the development. So it wasn't just the sustainable drainage that we were looking at as in isolation as a kind of functional element. It was very much a functional landscape. We were looking at the landscape as a whole, developed a suite of street typologies that were quite different from what you might see in a traditional industrial park, quite organic, and each of those had their own elements of sustainable drainage that sit alongside them and form part of the street typology, rather than just being considered as a discrete element. And just an example here to show the approach that we employed on the junctions, where previously you might have a mini roundabout or similar engineered solution. We actually had these very organic arrangements where the movements were shaped by boulders or logs. So it was a very natural landscape that we were looking to develop. The drainage plan, I think looking at this now, 8 years on, we've probably done things slightly differently. The drainage network here actually starts off in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, works its way all the way around the development through these series of swales and pipes, back to a retention basin, a pond, and then out back again at the bottom left of the screen into the watercourse. So it's quite a convoluted, perhaps, network. Probably would have done it slightly differently, but decisions were all made for the right reasons at the time. And you can see here a cross-section through the street typologies that were proposed. The key point for me here in terms of the lessons learned and the evolution of the design is that at these concept stage, what we were showing on the sections there at the bottom right, I'm not sure if you'll be able to see it from the back, sorry, is very shallow street swales. So the intention was that the water would run off the carriageway essentially into a depression in the landscape, and that would attenuate and convey the water through the system. There's some specific lessons learned on the right-hand side of the screen there that I'll run through in a minute, but actually just looking at the detail that we ended up with being implemented, we went from those very shallow street swales to these quite deep engineered ditches. Again, I had to go back through the file to work out the justification and the reasons for the design change decisions that had led us to this point. And there was a series of key points. First of all, there were concerns about draining into areas that accommodated trees, which is something that I think we could straightforwardly overcome now, 8 years on, in terms of specification. The building drainage, the roof drainage, was taken traditionally below ground and then piped into these systems, which obviously has an influence on the depth. Again, it's something that we could do differently. And I think actually the maintenance team, through the maintenance agreements, they had to separate out the drainage and the landscape elements. So we had to be able to specifically say, this item is drainage and must be maintained under this element of the maintenance contract. So there were reasons behind all the decisions. I don't think we ended up with necessarily the right solution, but I think it's a useful learning curve, and it's why we're presenting it as a case study today. Some of the challenges we faced through the kind of planning and concept design stage, as I said earlier, the requirement for sustainability and sustainable drainage was embodied in the brief from the outset. But the project manager and some of the co-consultants were a little bit resistant initially, perhaps through not quite understanding what it was that we were trying to achieve. Modelling of the system. Hydraulically, it's obviously quite straightforward to model a series of pipes and tanks, but at a time in particular, it was very difficult to set up the software to model a series of channels and rills and swales. Justification of avoiding guardrails. Certainly when the swales got deeper and around the pond, we'd created this quite naturalistic landscape, and we really wanted to avoid having to provide guardrails throughout, which was something that we had to work hard to justify. And one that we hadn't come across before, but actually with the pond and the overhead pylons, the water body can act as a conductor for electricity. I will, on the next slide, I explain how we responded to these challenges, so we are coming to that. Challenges during construction, a lot of them Sue's already touched on. The main contractor and subcontractors didn't really understand what we were trying to achieve. I think they just thought we were trying to make their lives difficult. They didn't recognise the details, so it was an exceptional contractor that delivered the scheme, but they hadn't seen the proposed details before. I think you'll find with any contractor that they try and default to things that they've learned, things that they've done previously. And the importance of soils. We had issues in particular around tracking of soils during construction and overcompaction. So how do we overcome these challenges? The case studies and precedent played a massive part in demonstrating to everyone involved what we were trying to achieve. It's a lot easier to find these case studies and precedents now with the work that Paul and the guys at Syria have done. But back in 2010, it was more difficult to provide these case studies and actually be able to take people to places and point to things and see, this is what we're going to be delivering. We undertook a series of risk assessments to demonstrate that actually there is no need for guardrails around the specific elements. You can employ other measures such as managing the gradients of the banks on the pond. One of the key elements or the factors that influenced, and I think was the point where everything clicked in terms of the risk assessment, was looking at canal infrastructure. We're surrounded by networks of canals, and there's no guardrails on those systems in the majority of cases, and it is relatively a safe environment. Strong client leadership, fundamental really. In this case, it was presented to us in the brief, the aspirations and the credentials that wanted to be achieved. So we didn't have to do any promotion or convincing or selling of the principles to the client. In some cases, it is necessary to do that to get a client on board and demonstrate the value that you can add through this different approach to the landscape design. But in this instance, being able to constantly refer back to the brief and to the client when issues arose and say that this is what we're here to do, this is the challenge we've been set, this is our brief, and this is why we're delivering along these lines. Key in terms of the construction was actually, and it didn't occur to us until we were some way into the process, we hadn't ever presented the vision to the contractor. So they'd had the construction details, but what made a massive difference was actually sitting down with the site agent, the site manager, talking them through the proposals from the slides that you've seen at the start here, from the concept, so they could fully understand why we were designing the way we were and what we were trying to achieve. And from that point on, it wasn't just that they understood, but they fully embraced the aspirations and really got behind what we were trying to deliver. And then sitting down with the guys on the tools and talking them through the specific details. I think one point that's not actually referenced here is the importance of our role as consultants in making sure that the details are really, really clear and detailed. It can be quite easy to draw something that you understand and assume that a contractor can understand that as well. But when they've not seen these details before, it's quite easy to misinterpret or not fully understand the importance of a very fine detail such as lapping a geotextile or a geomembrane. But then sitting down with the guys, talking them through the details, explaining the importance of the different elements, and then actually getting on site while they're building it and saying, no, you need to be doing this differently, just do that slightly differently and everything will come together. That communication and investing that time in the relationship with the contractor, both from explaining the concept through to spending time with them on site, working through key details. The relationship that we developed was much more positive. It got to the point with them where rather than resisting what we were trying to achieve, they were coming forward with suggestions that were very much improvements and enhancements to the solutions that we were proposing. So I think that's the key message, I think, is bind the contractor, bind the people that are building these schemes into the process from as early a stage as possible, get them on board with the vision and the concept, and then talk through the details with them.